NVIDIA just launched its GTX 1060 video card, including the Founders Edition and the AIB partner models, all today. And in theory, the price floor stretches down to $250, though we've seen how that's worked with Pascal thus far. And the Founders Edition is priced at $300. The new GTX 1060 uses the GP106 GPU. It's a slightly cut down version of the GP104, 200, and 400 chips that we've seen on the 1070 and 1080. And before getting to this review, this coverage is brought to you by MSI and their new X99A gaming motherboards for Broadwell E, including the X99A titanium board with pretty serious power phase design. When the GTX 1060 initially launched, we'd already published estimated specs that turned out to be pretty much dead on. That included speculation on TMU count, TPCs, SMs, and GPCs. And just as an FYI, we're able to extract all of these numbers by using simple math. So each Pascal GeForce GPU hosts 128 CUDA cores per SM. So by knowing the total CUDA core count of 1280 cores on the GTX 1060, we can divide by 128 and find that the GP106 GPU has 10 SMs split into clusters of 5 between 2 GPCs, or graphics processing clusters. You can learn more about that on the website. We also know that each SM hosts 8 TMUs, or texture map units, yielding 80 TMUs on the GTX 1060. For more on the low-level specs and the drill down, hit the link in the description below for the article, and you can learn more about that stuff. As far as top-level stuff, the GTX 1060 Founders Edition, this is clocked at 1506 megahertz base, and it's got a 1708 megahertz boost clock, and the MSI card comes in a bit above that, hitting somewhere in the range of 1809 megahertz or thereabouts when we're running it with its OC mode enabled. The memory is GDDR5 and it runs at 8 gigabits per second, or if you prefer 8 gigahertz, basically the same thing for this type of measurement. And that is G5, not GDDR5X or G5X. Memory bandwidth is at 192 gigabytes per second, calculable by using another simple equation. It's memory bus width divided by 8 to convert bits to bytes, multiplied by the memory clock, then by 2 for DDR, and then by 2 again for GDDR5. The GTX 1060 has a TDP of 120 watts and uses a single 6-pin power header. Note that AMD and NVIDIA TDP numbers cannot be linearly and directly compared, as they are generated using different standards, and it's more of a measurement of what's required to cool the thing than anything. We use our own power draw test later to compare the two. The table on the screen now shows our bench components. Check the full article for complete test methodology, drivers used, and more architecture depth. We have more than 1,000 words dedicated to test methodology, so I'm not going to go through all of it here. We're going to start with thermals because it reveals some pretty interesting traits of the Founders Edition cooler, especially when compared against an aftermarket cooler like the Twin Frozer 6 cooler, which, by the way, is identical on the MSI 1060, 1070, and 1080. For the most part, there's a few heatsink differences. There's some missing or slimmed down heat sinks on things like the PWM, but basically the same design. So we look at those two with endurance and short-term testing with thermals. Let's start with peak average thermals and then move on to throttling analysis. The GTX 1060 Founders Edition card runs at 43.6C delta T over ambient. See our channel for an explanation on what that means. And when under full load, that's what it's hitting, but idle, it's hitting 6.15C. To compare, the MSI GTX 1060 Gaming X, which we've also got here with Twin Frozer 6 cooler, and noteworthy, a higher clock rate, lands at 37.36 Celsius. And that, for both of these cards, is a good deal lower than what we saw on the 1070 and 1080. The GTX 1070 FE operated at 53.86 Celsius load, making the GTX 1060 FE a full 10C cooler than the 1070. Compared between the 1070 Gaming X and 1060 Gaming X, again, pretty comparable, similar cooler from MSI, we see the GTX 1060 Gaming X runs 4.4C lower with identical-ish coolers, and the GTX 1080 FE runs at 57.51 Celsius, or if you add in ambient, it's hitting an 82C hard stop throttle, which we explore in our 1080 review if you're curious. Either way you take it, GP106 is a considerably cooler chip than what we saw with GP104, especially when looking at the reference design cooler, or Founders Edition, or whatever they want to call it these days. And that thermal reduction is a direct result of the lower performance, which demands, of course, less power to sort of fuel the card. Here's the chart as it appears over time, listing only a few cards. The full chart is on the site. Our thermal testing is fully automated, so test execution is exactly the same each time, and this is somewhat useful. But if we look at this chart another way, we can add in an endurance metric. So now we're looking at thermals and clock rate of the reference or Founders Edition card over time, you can see that the clock rate remains stable throughout the majority of the test and is able to sustain temperatures shown here in their actual non-delta values around 67 to 72 Celsius. There are a few sudden spikes that plunge the clock rate to a couple hundred megahertz, and that manifests itself as sudden frame drops in gameplay. These last a fraction of a second and are noticeable, but aren't frequent enough to get mad about in general. The GTX 1080 had bigger issues when running this OC endurance test on the FE card, and again, we look at that in that review. Let's zoom in on this chart though. This version shows the temperature scale blown up and the time scale blown up, so it just basically turns it into more of a microscope as to when the clock plummets, and the frequency falls in step with temperature hitting 71C, which seems to be the throttle point of the GTX 1060 and its auto stock settings, including the auto fan. This could be worked around by increasing fan RPM, which we also measured and is shown on this chart. You can see the fan RPM was capped at 60%, which is probably a noise consideration that we'll talk about in a moment. But what about MSI's cooler? Let's see if the aftermarket cards are able to compensate for the occasional frequency drops with a better cooler. And it does, sort of, anyway. First of all, the overall clock rate is higher as a result of the pre-OC applied by MSI, so we're at nearly 2 gigahertz here. It's hitting 1900 something, depending on what game we're running. And notice that the line is almost perfectly flat. That's what you want. The GTX 1060 FE had a spiky line with constant fluctuation, something we've seen on most reference cards from both vendors. And this has been resolved by more advanced coolers with the aftermarket add-in board partners. This creates a perfectly stable and repeatable frame rate throughout the looping metro test. We're still hitting those big spikes though. If you look around the 100-minute mark in the burn-in, it's shown that we definitely don't have a perfect solution here with just an aftermarket cooler. So we'll put this card under liquid like we did for the previous cards and see if it actually fixes anything or if it's some sort of lower level voltage or electrical thing. As for RPM, MSI starts at 0% fan speed, shown here, and relies on the heatsink for cooling at a lower than 60 Celsius temperature. And that's when the fan clearly kicks in. So we have crossbars on the screen now to demonstrate what's happening here. It sits below 40% RPM even when under full load. For in-depth thermals, check the article for more as always, but let's get into noise. So for a quick look at noise, we've got the chart on the screen now. We measure in idle noise, which is captured at the desktop. We measure the auto fan noise, which is captured after about a 5-minute gaming workload burn-in. And then after auto, we switch between a 50% and a 100% fan speed test, so you can see what it looks like in an absolute worst case scenario, and all of that is represented here. Now, GPU fans will basically never hit 100% unless it's in some sort of really constricted environment like a mini ITX case. Generally, and this is true for these cards as well, you're going to be in the 50% range for fan speed at its max, and the MSI card was below 40% almost all the time. The Founders Edition card was about 50 to 60% depending on the workload. So that's what we got for noise levels. As for power, we're still working on more in-depth power testing for the future, but for now, we're still using a wall meter and we're doing total system power draw. That means you're basically looking at deltas between devices because we're measuring the total system draw, not just for the card. So for what we've got here, we measure in apparent power draw, which is represented as volt amps or VA. And we're seeing the GTX 1060 FE run 72 volt amps idle when with the rest of the build, of course. And that system with a 1060 FE runs at 218.6 volt amps under load. This makes it the least power hungry card currently on our rebuild bench, though that will change as we introduce things like the RX 470, 460, and potentially a future GTX 1050. The MSI variant is slightly more power hungry at 98 volt amps idle and 222 load. And overclocking sees the cards, of course, boost in their power draw. The MSI card is able to run a slightly lower voltage with its overclock and sustain the clock rate with greater stability than the Founders Edition card, and that does impact the power draw here, or apparent power draw, I should say. Time to get into the frame rates. We ran 9 or so games through the bench, but only have a few of them here. Link in the description below for all of those games. And as a reminder, we convey our metrics as average FPS 1% and 0.1% lows, which helps showcase the poor frame times that sometimes occur, and you can learn more about that on the channel where we have a video explaining those three numbers. First, Shadow of Mordor at 1080p Ultra. Those very tightly timed 1% and 0.1% low values you're seeing on the GTX 1060 are largely a result of its generally stable clock rate, and the other optimizations in architecture also help, of course. But the GTX 1060 outputs 87.7 FPS average, 68.7 FPS 1% low, 66.1% lows, and the RX 480 as comparison is at 78 FPS average. The percent difference between the two, 1060 FE and RX 480 reference, is 11%, with the 1% lows differentiated by 50.5%. Looking at the MSI 1060 Gaming X pre-overclocked, we're hitting about the same FPS, so it's mostly a thermal advantage on FPS advantage, and the difference between the 1070 and 1060 FE cards is 31%. 1440p has both the MSI and FE GTX 1060s at 63 FPS average, landing them well within playability for Mordor, which really doesn't demand that high of a frame rate. The RX 480 runs at 58 FPS, or a percent difference of 8% between the RX 480 reference and the FE 1060. The 1070 runs at 77 FPS average, though with repeatedly lower 1% low values, and the 1070 is separated by a 20% difference from the GTX 1060s at 1440p. 4K is a serious struggle for these cards. They're really not quite low end, but they're definitely lower end, and they're not really built for 4K either. The 1060 runs at 35 to 36 FPS between the FE and Gaming X cards, and the RX 480 sits at 32 FPS. Not a noticeable difference since the game becomes choppy at this point anyway, but certainly a measurable one. The GTX 1070 R9 390X are more capable cards than either of these, running at 51 FPS average and 41 FPS average respectively. GTA 5 remains one of our most demanding gaming benchmarks. At 1080p with very high and ultra settings, we're hitting 95 FPS average on the GTX 1060 FE. The 1% and 0.1% lows remain reasonably tightly timed and above 60 FPS even for the dips. The RX 480 is competitive at 85.3 FPS, marking a difference of 10.8% between the FE and 480 reference cards. This is consistent with Mordor in terms of percent difference scaling, and the GTX 1070 FE sits at 120.3 FPS, or a difference of 23.5% from the 1060, comparing the two with percent difference formula. Moving on to 4K, the 1060 predictably struggles at 33 FPS average, though it still sits above the SSC version of the 970. We've only run a few of the most recent cards through GTA 5 at 1440p, and just for the curious, we're getting 63 FPS average on the 1060 and about the same on the RX 480. Our full Mirror's Edge Catalyst analysis is already on the channel, but let's start with 1080p Ultra here. We see the FE card hitting 82 FPS average, while the MSI card hits 86, or a difference of 4.7% from that pre-OC. The RX 480 8GB card is at 74 FPS, or about a 10% difference from the GTX 1060 FE. Again, consistent with the previous few titles. The GTX 960 SSC pre-OC'd pretty reasonably, sits at 51 FPS, or a full 46.6% different from the GTX 1060 FE. That's a pretty large generational growth, even actually especially considering the SSC model of the 960. At 1440p Ultra, the GTX 1060 FE and Gaming X remain gapped similarly to 1080p, both just below 60 FPS. The RX 480 8GB struggles with 0.1% low values, dipping to 20 FPS with the 8GB card while keeping a 47 FPS average. You'd want to drop to high settings for a more fluid output here, as those lows introduce a lot of stuttering and jarring motion. 1080p Hyper runs well on the 1060s, keeping near 60 FPS average, and the RX 480 sits around 53 FPS, also pretty reasonable, though the 4GB card struggles with its 18 FPS, 0.1% lows, and 40 FPS average. We explained this phenomenon in the RX 480 4GB versus 8GB test. 4K had the GTX 1060s at or below 30 FPS with high settings depending on the card. You can see more of that chart in the article. Black Ops 3 tends to favor AMD cards a little more than some of our other games tested, and it's also somewhat clock sensitive depending on the instance, the settings, things like that. At 1080p, we're seeing the GTX 1060 FE run at 122.7 FPS average, and the RX 480 cards at 127 FPS average and 132 FPS average depending on if it's 4 or 8 gigabytes. The MSI GTX 1060 Gaming X is at 129.3, so we've got a couple FPS gain, actually 7 FPS gain over the FE card, and that marks a difference in averages of 5%. The RX 480 8GB and GTX 1060 Fe are differentiated by 7.5%. At 1440p, all of these cards remain well within playable range, even for a competitive FPS. The 1060 Fe is at 78 FPS average, Gaming X at 82.3 FPS average, so we got a bit of a 5 FPS gain there. And the RX 480 is at 83 FPS average, so it's mostly tied. 4K sees the FE 1060 dip to 38 FPS average, and the 4GB RX 480 suddenly becomes unplayable with its 12.7 FPS, 0.1% lows. The Gaming X sits at 40.3 FPS, so you'd ideally dip the settings for faster competitive play if desperate to use any of these cards at 4K, but 1440p is a much better fit. Ashes of Singularity shows NVIDIA's DirectX 11 optimization focus, and AMD, meanwhile, shows that they've done better with DirectX 12, and their DirectX 11 performance is pretty bad. At 1080p high, the GTX 1060 runs at 45.3 FPS average for DX11, that's the FE version, and about 47 FPS for DX12. The RX 480 performs significantly worse with DX11 at 26 FPS average, but is effectively tied when using DX12. And the scaling continues to 4K high, though the RX 480 actually pulls marginally ahead of the GTX 1060, about 0.8 FPS when using DX12. Let's look at frame latencies in milliseconds. This is the average frame latency here. The GTX 1060 Fe runs an average millisecond frame time, that's the time between frames, of 21.29 milliseconds with DX12 versus 22.07 for DX11, slight improvement. The RX 480 8GB sits at 22.22 average time between frames in milliseconds for DX12 versus 39.26 for DX11. That is a huge performance, almost 2x. The 1070 is at 15.43 milliseconds average time between frames with DX12, and the 390X, just for comparison to last gen, is at 20.46 milliseconds. We've got more Ashes charts on the website, including latency percent change, and several other games are also on the site, including Doom, Assassin's Creed Syndicate in some light fashion. We've also got Vulkan and OpenGL testing with Doom, The Division, Metro, Talos Principle, and some other stuff. So hit the link in the description below for all of that. Overclocking the GTX 1060 is the same as the previous Pascal cards. We are bypassing the voltage frequency curve. It was really a cool idea on paper, but I find it very annoying as someone who has an idea of what I'm doing, and I'm sure that's true for a lot of folks out there. So we're still using the slider manual approach to overclocking, and as for results, we've got this stepping table that shows progression of the FE version's overclock. The peak clock just shows the spikes and can be somewhat ignored. Core clock is the column you want to look at. This is the one that we measure after some burn-in and find that it seems to be about where the clock sits at once stable. We managed to hit a stable core clock of approximately 2088 megahertz on the FE card, with peaks at 2151.5 megahertz. The clock stabilized at 2088 during the endurance burn-in, so that's what we're showing here. The memory was overclocked by 450 megahertz offset, so that puts at 4455 megahertz, and that's with a power target maxed out at 116% and the fan at about 2000 RPM. The overclock is a 250 megahertz offset from core. As an aside, notice that in that second step in our table for overclock progression, we see an increase in the core clock stability just by increasing power target and nothing else. So that's something that's worth learning about. As for MSI's card, we hit about the same overclock frequency and struggled to push much beyond what's shown on the screen. MSI's card was able to sustain its higher OCs with a lower voltage though, which is always beneficial to power draw. And if you want to see overclock thermal stability charts, check the article. But here's a quick look at the frame rate charts. GTA 5 at 4K sees a slight boost from 33 FPS average to 36.7 FPS average, or a 10.6% difference. That's the FE card. And at 1080p, it posts the GTX 1060 at 95 FPS average with the stock clock, and then 104.5 for the OC'd variant, another difference of about 10%, 9.5 actually. Shadow of Mordor at 1080p posts a jump of about 9 FPS on the GTX 1060 Fe with the overclock. The RX 480 reference sits at 85 FPS with its 1340 MHz clock rate, a gain of about 7 FPS average. 1440p tests push the 1060 Fe from 63 FPS to 70 FPS average, and more on this in the article, along with Mirror's Edge Catalyst overclocking results. And that leads us to the conclusion. So the recent video card releases from both AMD and NVIDIA have pretty much shown that 1440p gaming is now a real possibility, even at those higher settings, when looking at the sort of mid-range card market. So previously, it was not really possible for a $200 video card to run 1440p games with higher graphics settings. And that's shown pretty well in our charts where we do have the 960 SSC presence. I know it's not all of them, but we have it in some charts. And you see a 40 to 50% difference between the 1060 FE and the overclocked 960, which was the SSC version from EVGA. That's all we got. So 40 to 50% gain is pretty big. Or I should say 40 to 50% difference, not percent change, but percent difference. And that's what allows 1440p gaming to become more of a reality. The RX 480 sees similarly large gains from the R9 380 and even the 380X. So this is a thing now that's possible. It's time really for a lot of the budget to mid-tier gaming setups to be looking into monitor upgrades, I would imagine, if they're still on 1080p. Now, standalone, let's ignore the comparison, the obvious one, to the RX 480 for a moment, and just talk about the GTX 1060 as a product. It runs reasonably cool with the Founders Edition cooler, and this is really a big change from what we saw with the GTX 1080. 1080 wasn't awful, but we saw some thermal throttling on it because it was hitting that 82C threshold really easily, and that's just a result of a higher TDP chip. I'm not going to say a high TDP chip, but certainly higher than the 1060 under the very basic blower fan cooler. And we resolved that by putting it underwater and showing how much liquid actually can improve things, or just better air if you have something more standard like one of these, Twin Frozer or ACX or Windforce or whatever, one of those Strix, all those will improve over the Founders Edition and reference cards. And that's something we've said since the 1080 and 1070 reviews. GP106 is a big part of this. So GP106 is a lot cooler, it's lower TDP and lower measurable power draw than the 1070 and 1080. That's a big reason we're seeing the thermal reduction. The stability isn't bad. Clock rate stability is generally acceptable on the FE card, which is, the FE card is pretty stable. We see some clock rate spiking where you get that effect in the chart, but it's not big spikes. There's a couple big spikes, and they are pretty large. They're from the operating frequency to a couple hundred megahertz, but those are rare, and they're spaced out enough that even though you can see a very quick and short stutter in frame output, it's not something that's going to repeat with great regularity. It's not too annoying, and it's not honestly outside of what we see with pretty much every card on the market, except for the higher end liquid cooled ones like the hybrid and things like that, or the hybrid we built, I should say, which is this one here on the table. As for the head-to-head with AMD, the RX 480 is the obvious competition here. It comes in two flavors, 4 gigabytes and 8 gigabytes. The GTX 1060 is strictly 6 gigabytes. It does not have an 8 gigabyte model, does not have a 4 gigabyte or 2 gigabyte model. So you're looking at a card that is priced at $300 for the Founders Edition version and $250 as the bottom end recommended price for AIB partners. That does not mean they will be available there, but they should be eventually. That's normally how the market works. Immediate launch, they may not be though. So you're looking at $250 to $300 for a 6 gigabyte GTX 1060 that on average in our test that we've shown in this video performs about 10% different than the RX 480 improvement over the 480 versus a $200 4 gigabyte card that performs fairly comparably to the 1060 in a lot of cases, but not all. Assassin's Creed Syndicate, The Division are good examples of games where you really do actually see a real deficit with that 4 gigabytes, or the 8 gigabyte model for $240. So let's just look at those two. 8 gigabyte, $240 card versus 6 gigabyte, which of course is more to it than that because it's architecture, but 6 gigabyte, $250 to $300 card. If you can find a 1060 for $250, it would be a very good consideration at that price point if you're already looking at a 480, especially if the 480 uses the reference cooler, because we found that really, quite honestly, the reference cooler was trash. If you can find an aftermarket cooler, i.e. from an AIB partner, for the RX 480 for around the 240 to 260 mark versus an AIB partner GTX 1060 for around the 250, 260 mark, then that's the real comparison to be making. You'll want to look at the specific review for that product. But in terms of frame rate performance, general considerations of overclocking aside, the difference is about 10% in most games. That difference is certainly measurable. In some games, it may be perceptible if you're pushing just barely past whatever frame rate threshold you're targeting. But for the most part, they are both reasonable performers at 1080p and at 1440p. Do not expect 4K from either of these cards. So that's most of what I got for you. They are both decent cards. The 1060 FE does cool better, but it's $300. So we really can't consider it too directly as a comparison. That's all the data though. So I've given you all the data you need. Hopefully you can make a decision from that. I'm not going to make one for you. We try not to do that for anyone. If you have questions, post them below. Do our best to answer. Article in the description below for full in-depth details, including additional games testing and some more of the opinion side that we don't have here. And of course, Patreon link in the post-roll video to help us out directly. Subscribe as always. Thank you for watching. I'll see you all next time. So by knowing the total, again, another FYI is calculable, and that's probably a noise configuration.